Welcome back everyone. As most of you know, Apple went ahead and announced their brand new 14-inch M1 Pro MacBook Pro, I guess, whatever you're going to call it. I went ahead, picked it up, so let's go ahead and compare it against the cheapest M1 MacBook Air that Apple actually makes, the M1 MacBook Air. Who'd have guessed it? Now the price tag between these two is actually very interesting. So the M1 MacBook Air is half the cost of the 14-inch M1 MacBook Pro. So $999 for the M1 MacBook Air, $1999 for the 14-inch MacBook Pro. So you're getting some pros, you're getting some cons on both of them. And I will tell you, it's a pretty interesting matchup between these two, which is super crazy. So starting off with the colors, I do want to state, you did get more color options with the MacBook Air, including my favorite gold color of the MacBook. I love the gold color. I can't believe Apple hasn't put it in for these Pro models, but that is my favorite color of all time. And you do have that option of getting it on the Air. You don't have it on the 14-inch, but totally okay. Now the screen sizes and the screens themselves are pretty much one of the biggest differences between them. So the M1 MacBook Air has a 13.3-inch Retina display and it looks beautiful. I had no issues with it. I wasn't even complaining about the bezel too much, to be honest, and I do think this is a very good panel. Now with the 14-inch MacBook, it's a 14.2-inch Liquid Retina XDR panel, and this is one of the best panels ever. It's, first of all, bigger. It looks like it's a really good panel regardless of anything else, and you have a less amount of bezel on it compared to the M1 MacBook Air, so that could be a good thing for a lot of you. If you're somebody who wants to go ahead and just pick up a MacBook and have a really good display, the 14-inch MacBook Pro is the display for you. This thing's going to be lasting forever. Apple spent a lot of time redesigning these MacBooks, so it only makes sense for them to go ahead and just kind of keep recycling this design, in my opinion. So if you pick up this MacBook today, it's going to be here for a long time. But the biggest thing and the biggest difference, in my opinion, between these two is that the M1 MacBook Pro, the 14-inch one, actually has ProMotion on that display, which is 120 Hz. The M1 MacBook Air doesn't have it. It's probably going to be like 5 years until we even see it on this MacBook. So that is a really big thing to keep in mind. In my opinion, the display in and of itself is one of the biggest reasons to go from an M1 MacBook Air to an M1 MacBook Pro, the 14-inch one. The display on that is so much bigger. It does have a notch, so if that bothers you, you can always go ahead and go down to the MacBook Air, but there are ways to kind of hide it here and there, which I've demonstrated on my second channel. So it's a really cool thing. I'm a fan of it, and I do think when it comes down to it, the 14-inch MacBook Pro it just has such a good panel, and I'm a huge fan of it. But the other thing to keep in mind is the port selection on the MacBook Pro. You actually have not only an extra USB Type-C port, with the MacBook Air only had 2 on one side, we now have 3, so technically 1 on each side, but we have 2 on the left side and then 1 on the right side, but we also have an SD card slot built in. But that's not even all. We also have an HDMI cord port built in, which I honestly don't know, I'm not a fan of that, but the SD card thing I'm a humongous fan of. And then we have the USB Type-C port on that right side. Left side, we have 2 USB Type-C ports, and then we have a MagSafe charging port as well. So it's just crazy the amount of stuff Apple put into this specific MacBook, and definitely this specific I/O on this MacBook beats the M1 MacBook Air by a long shot. And it's quite obvious, it's not even a secret. Apple's not trying to hide it. They went ahead and pretty much redesigned this whole entire MacBook, and it definitely looks so much better in my opinion, and it's not even close. So when it comes down to that, you're definitely getting a much better MacBook on that specific device on the 14-inch MacBook with all those ports than the M1 MacBook Air. Now another big thing to keep in mind is actually the longevity of both of them. With the M1 MacBook Air, this thing just came out not even a year ago. The 14-inch M1 MacBook Pro just came out too, it's more recent. So theoretically in my head, I want to say that the 14-inch MacBook Pro may end up outlasting the M1 MacBook Air in terms of the longevity, in terms of software updates and everything. So I don't know which one may outbeat the other one, but a big thing to keep in mind is that regardless, both of these things are going to be supported for many, many years. So it's not like tomorrow these things are going to be outdated. That is not going to be the case. These things are going to be getting support for many years. And to be honest, even if you get this MacBook today, you were probably not going to keep this MacBook for the duration of how much software it's going to get. This is just kind of how it goes. You probably will upgrade 4 years from now, and these things will probably still get software updates, which is so crazy to think about. So in terms of that covers it up in the longevity standpoint. Now, by far the performance segment is the area that is probably going to be the biggest difference between these two. And here's the thing: if you want a MacBook that is the best performing MacBook of all time, you want a MacBook you can pick up today and it's going to be able to handle everything you throw at it, and you want to be able to spec it out the highest, then by all means, you should probably pick up the M1 MacBook Pro 14-inch. That thing can do everything you'd ever want in a MacBook. It has all sorts of capability, and it probably is the fastest MacBook of all time. You have the M1 Pro chip, and you have the M1 Max chip. Now to give you some numbers, okay, the M1 MacBook Pro, the 14-inch one, goes up to 10 cores for the CPU. You can go up to 32 cores for the GPU, and you can get up to 64 gigs of RAM on that specific MacBook. Now on the M1 MacBook Air, these things you can get an 8-core CPU inside of it, you can get an 8-core GPU inside of it, and you can get 16 gigs of RAM on that specific MacBook. So like I mentioned already, you're seeing a few differences right there, and I'm going to be honest, if you want a MacBook that has the most amount of performance, well, like I've said before, getting that M1 MacBook Pro, the 14-inch one, is the better way to go in every single dimension, in every single area. So that's a MacBook you can pick up today, and you won't have to worry about anything else ever again. But here's the other thing. The M1 MacBook Air is already a very good performing device. It can really handle everything you throw at it, and I'm not just saying it. It is easily one of the best performing MacBooks of all time, and I am by far a humongous fan of the specific MacBook. In reality, whatever you do with it, it's going to be able to handle it. I've personally owned an M1 MacBook Pro for the last year or so, or last 7-8 months, and it's been a very good experience. Like, it's been a solid experience for performance. It's really done everything I can think of. Like, I haven't had any complaints on the performance side, and if the M1 MacBook Pro, the 14-inch one, is any better, then that's perfect. But the M1 MacBook Air pretty much has the same amount of chipset and the same amount of performance as the M1 MacBook Pro. There's a little difference here and there. So I'll tell you, if you want the faster performing machine, the 14-inch one is the better way to go, but you will probably not even use all the performance of the M1 MacBook Air. And I think that's the best way I can put it. Obviously, if you need the most amount of power, you think you're a power user, then get that MacBook Pro 14-inch, but that MacBook Air is a very good performing machine as well. So in terms of that covers it up there. Battery life is also another area which is very, very strange. You would think that the 14-inch M1 MacBook Pro has a better battery life, and although I think the battery life on that is really good, I've been testing for the last couple of days, it seems good. Based on Apple's own website, they actually do state that the M1 MacBook Air has better battery life than the M1 MacBook Pro 14-inch. So the numbers that they state is that the MacBook Pro 14-inch goes up to 17 hours of battery life. The M1 MacBook Air gets up to 18 hours of battery life. So right there is another weird difference. You wouldn't really think that the M1 MacBook Air would beat the 14-inch MacBook Pro because it's so much bigger. You would think there's a bigger battery inside of it and it's twice the price, but that's not really the case. So again, if you want the MacBook with the best battery life, at least between these two, the M1 MacBook Air may be the better way to go for you. So in terms of that covers it up there. And to be honest, I will tell you, I think the MacBook Pro 14-inch MacBook, if you have all the money in the world, getting that MacBook is the better way to go. You know, it can really do everything. It's going to future-proof yourself for a long time, and it has the most amount of capability. But here's the other thing. The M1 MacBook Air is the better value per dollar by a long shot. I mean, the performance is extremely good on that MacBook. It can, like I mentioned, do every single thing I threw at it. It handled it perfectly fine whenever I used it. I currently use the M1 MacBook Pro. That's a powerhouse of a machine too. And that thing, I mean, if I, even at my level of exporting video, like 10, 12 videos every single day, well, this thing can easily do it, and I don't have a problem with the performance side of this MacBook at all. If you need more performance, then definitely get something like the 14-inch MacBook, but I think a majority of you out there will be more than happy with the MacBook Air, in my opinion. So in terms of that covers it up here. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.